So this is it, the final leg. In 20 minutes' time, we're all going to be in the pub. At least if it runs to 20 minutes, I asked Will to give me a little bit extra on the clock to finish up, because what I want to do is leave you on a high, is leave you with something that you can take back to the coalface of radio with you, something that will encourage and inspire, something that you can take back from Next Radio and say, yes, radio has a future, because I'm incredibly excited and incredibly optimistic about the next 5 years of radio. I don't think our greatest radio lies behind us in the last 90 years. I think it'll come in the next 5. And this is why. No one is listening. Now, Radio are going to have to find some sort of thesaurus to measure what it is that we're doing. And I apologise to Fee Glover and the Listening Project, because obviously they take listening very seriously. What they're doing actually is not listening, it's a conversation. No one would listen to the Listening Project if it was just one person banging on about something. What makes the Listening Project work is the fact that it's a conversation. And that's what radio is. It's not a piece of furniture, it's a conversation. And the ability for it to become a conversation has been transformed in the last 5 to 10 years by a massive shift in bandwidth. Nobody is listening anymore. No one listens to the radio, no one watches television. You're not even really listening to me now. You might be Googling what I do for a living. You might be tweeting about the fact that I just claimed that nobody is listening. You might be looking at a picture that I just took backstage of the dressing room, which is really rather fancy, just round the corner. But no one is actually listening. And even if you're not doing any of those things, I cheated yesterday and I looked up all about you lot. Because I, as the presenter, have the power to use these tools to find out about you. You know that lanyard thing that some of you signed up for, or all the people that James, very helpfully for our analytics, follows on Twitter? I know that 3 times as many people in this room follow Alan Partridge as follow Lady Gaga. That makes this a unique audience. Nowhere else in the world would you find that. Nowhere else would you find somebody who gets 3 times that many followers who's 150 years old. Trevor Dan is the 3rd most socially influential person in this room. He shouldn't even be allowed on Twitter. I know about this audience because we're not just listeners, we're engaged. This is a conversation that you can carry on now and afterwards in the pub, and then it will echo in the Twitter sphere, hopefully. Why? Because the bandwidth between you and me has been utterly transformed. And the thing we need to understand is that a lot of what happens in society now is driven by radical changes in bandwidth. A few years ago, I knew exactly what processor my computer had in it, how much memory it had, how big the hard disk was. I'm a pretty geeky programmer, and I actually don't know that about my current laptop. Couldn't tell you those numbers. Actually, I do know how much memory it has. The rest I've forgotten. But I know exactly how much ADSL bandwidth I get in my house. And I test it regularly to see if I'm actually getting that amount. And I know that in exactly 2 weeks' time, BT Infinity is going to be installed. And I, and particularly my teenage children, are incredibly excited about that. Because everything we do is limited and constrained and controlled, technically at the moment, by the barrier of bandwidth. And this matters to us as an industry. It matters massively to radio because we're in the bandwidth business. For years, we have sold rule-driven, regulated bandwidth and monetized it. But if you think the last 5 to 10 years were exciting, then it's going to change even more dramatically in the next 5. I did have, or I started to make, a little chart where I would show you what the bandwidth was like in 2000 and what you can get in your home now. The only problem was that if I made it visible on this screen, this auditorium would need to be the size of the Shard to show you the difference between what it was then and what it is available to you now. This is changing radically, and if we ignore it, it's not going to go away. It's just getting faster and faster and more powerful and more compelling. And if that doesn't scare you, this will. Within the next 2 to 3 years, as many cars will have access to the internet and internet radio as have DAB receivers. They're starting to ship in this quarter in the United States. They'll be here in the middle part of next year. And as 3G and 4G transform the ubiquitous supply of bandwidth, radio is going to have to compete like never before. But here's the exciting part. We have 90 years of history of monetizing bandwidth. The more bandwidth we have, the more connected we are to our audience, the better our content is. The most compelling radio content ever made is the stuff that's driven by the listeners. Actually, of course, they're not the listeners, are they? They're part of the conversation. What we do is we lay the tracks, the foundation. We put guidelines down, we hint and suggest what they might be talking about, and then we let them propel us through the conversation. Now, this, I think, is what Radio 1 had in mind when they kicked out Chris Moyles and brought in Nick Grimshaw. This is their sort of fantasy. This is how they see their listeners: young, connected, engaged. My teenagers, the best way to get them down to dinner is to turn off the Wi-Fi hub in the house. Seriously, they are the most connected and communicative bunch I know. Here's what we need to know as broadcasters. It's that content-centric one. These guys know how to mine for content, how to find what it is they want, whether it's legal, frankly, or slightly a grey area. They will find content on YouTube and wherever it is they can come across it. They don't care who the broadcaster is, and there's been a lot of talk about brands. They don't actually care about brands. What they care about is original and compelling content, and they are geniuses at finding that because they have the bandwidth and they have the tools and the technology to do it. What they're also good about doing is advertising, evangelizing, compelling, creative, original content to their peers. This is the generation we have to appeal to, not because they're young and trendy, but because they are hungry for the content that we are brilliant at producing. And if we produce it, not only will they come, but they'll bring their friends, they'll bring their peers, and they will promote our brands and our stations for us. That's what radio looks like when no one is listening. Not that first slide where radio is part of the furniture, but where the audience is engaged, reacting, and connecting with everything that happens. See, I'm already running out of time, so I can't really say much about this slide, except that will.i.am gave a keynote address at IBC. Frankly, that's a weird enough sentence in and of itself. But what he basically said was, go home and hug a programmer, which I liked. What he said was, go and find technical people and get them involved in the creative process. Change will revolutionize media, not when we ignore it, not when we pretend we need less of it, but when we make more of it and we engage with it and we become part of the creative driving force of technical change. So I want to talk about radio studios for our final session. Hopefully you all feel at home in a radio studio. Here from the 1930s we have a young Trevor Dann. He had hair then, but that's still him. That was in his WHAV US radio days, sometime in the early 1930s. And that's what a radio station used to look like. And in fact, when I first worked in radio 25 years ago, there was a fitted ashtray as part of the studio equipment. 20 years ago, they still had a grand piano in the main FM on-air studio. Does anyone have one of those now? Are you from the BBC, sir? Belgian public broadcaster still has. In the UK, we don't have a radio studio big enough to fit a grand piano anymore. Basically, they'd now just tuck you in a cupboard under the stairs. You could basically fit one of those Casio VL tone things in most of the FM studios I've seen today. But aren't they shiny, the modern studios? Aren't they magnificent? They're full of screens, they're full of software. That's the other technical change, by the way. We're full of bandwidth, and everything is now software. Screens and software, the only things that remain are the microphones and the headphones. But take a closer look, and there's nothing more social about that studio. It's still a sealed box, basically dedicated to producing audio that's going to get pushed out in one direction, stuff that's going to get fed out at the audience. There's actually nothing social about the design of that studio at all. I asked the chief engineer for the group of radio stations that owns that studio, who was involved in the design and construction of it, and said, how did you sort of weave social media and interaction? Now we have this huge bandwidth, this connection with the audience. How did you work that into the studio? And he said, I don't know. But he got on the phone the guy from Digital Online, and he didn't know either. You see, it's nobody's job to solve this problem. We just keep designing radio studios the way we've always designed them. Yet that seems daft, given what we've said about that change in bandwidth. We're no longer asymmetrical, us shouting and them sort of coming back with just dribs and drabs of the occasional text message or 6 different phone lines. And it's all software on the other end as well. They're listening on a PC or they're listening on Radio Player, and they are completely connected in real time to the studio. And yet most of the time we just carry on pushing out content and pushing out content. So if everything is software, software on the listener's end, software in the studio end, and everything in between is this massive amount of bandwidth. What are we using it for? Primarily, we're using it to give us a bigger mouth. That's natural, that's what we do. We promote ourselves, we promote the advertisers, we talk a lot. That's what we do. If you've ever phoned up a breakfast presenter and tried to get them to shut up or allow any dead air, even in a phone conversation, it's impossible. It's what we do. But social media is not about giving radio a bigger mouth. It's about giving us bigger ears to listen to all that bandwidth, all that stuff that's coming back into the studio. And the main thing that makes me excited about the future of radio is we're actually really good at this. Yes, we're a bandwidth business, and we're going to face some bandwidth competition, but we're also a curation business. You've heard that word a lot today. We curate music, news, and information. That's what radio is. It's an art form, actually. It's not a technology. We somewhat stupidly put AM and FM in the title like it's some sort of technology. It's not. Radio, when it's done well, is an art form of curating news, music, and information into content that is compelling, that is immediate, that is warm, that is intimate. Who here would rather hear Charlotte Green read the shipping forecast than fucking Siri? It's the same thing. Just information, but if you give it warmth, if you give it that hint of Radio 4 personality, just enough of a raised eyebrow, it's transformed. That's what curation means. And at the moment, Twitter and Facebook are spending billions to have algorithms and databases that will find out what they think people want to see on Twitter. And do you know what? I think we can do that because we have 90 years of experience as curators. We have trusted brands that people identify with. And through those brands, we can carry on a conversation. We can curate more of the listeners' tweets and Facebook messages and then engage with them to make that a more dynamic conversation, to become part of discovery in the social space as much as we are in the music discovery space. Okay, so how do we do this? After that phone conversation with the radio station about not having anything in the studio to sort this out, we set out to build some tools and technologies. I've spent the last year seeing various radio groups and stations around the world. Next week I'm in New York seeing WNYC, having a conversation. And what we insist upon, and you should do this when you get back to your groups, is you get somebody from production, ideally some of the producers from The Breakfast Show and the presenter, get somebody from engineering, from the technical part of the radio station, and then get somebody from digital and online. First thing you'll have to do is to introduce those three sets of people to each other because they never, ever meet anywhere. It's a left brain, right brain thing. Here's the scary part. The most creative people in radio stations in the last 15 years have been the accountants. Not because they're fiddling the books, but because they understand technology. I design user experiences and software for radio, have done for 25 years. The most creative users of that technology, the people who constantly ask me, what can this do? How far can I put this? What can this make happen? Have been the accountants. I'm sorry, creatives, but you haven't asked those questions yet. But you can. And when you do, we'll get radio out of this life support situation that we're in with automation and all the stuff that we're doing with the technology. Now, there's nothing wrong with what the accountants have asked. What they've asked us to do is to make slightly worse radio for a lot less money. That's been my design brief for the last 25 years, building studios for you guys, designing the technology. Can you make it slightly worse, but a lot cheaper? And when you do it, can you make sure the audience doesn't notice? Don't let them see the gaps. What I want us to do after Next Radio is to go away and make some technical changes that the audience will notice, that will drive original and compelling content that everybody will be tweeting about, that everyone will be talking about. So here are 10 minutes of tips and ideas of how to do that in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. We've invented a device called Oasis, which is essentially a giant box into which you can put those hundreds of thousands of tweets, hundreds of Facebook feeds, hundreds of Twitter feeds, even Google+. I said I was an optimist. You connect all of that into a giant box, which is very, very dull. But the thing we figured out a year ago was that box needs to have what we call context. It needs to know what the studio's doing. So that actually knows which station you are, which show you are, and who the host is in the studio. Because social media is actually really tough to do if you're a networked radio group. If you're some of the Heart and Capital brands, you might have 20-odd Facebook pages, 20 different Twitter feeds to react to and respond to. And network radio is very good at hiding that on FM and AM. But if you've ever looked for Heart or Capital on Radio Player, or you've tried to figure out what Facebook page you should be using, the plumbing really shows. So we've solved that by allowing all the correct information to be aggregated together and route to the correct studio. But then the clever stuff happens. Because we also reckoned, hang on a minute, everything in your studio is software. So we talk to the mixing console to know what that's doing. That's how we know what your network's doing. We talk to your playout system to know that you're just about to play a track by Lady Gaga. And then Oasis goes out to the official Facebook and Twitter feed for Lady Gaga and pulls what she just tweeted in. It also goes to that big box of tweets and Facebook messages and finds people who like and follow Lady Gaga or Rihanna or One Direction or whoever you're playing next and bubbles those to the top of what we call a smart queue, a context-based queue which goes and actually discovers what we call smart is content comes from the fire hose of stuff plus the correct context. So fire hose plus context equals content. We can find Twitter messages geographically for you. So yesterday's floods, simply tell us another quick queue, another smart queue. We'll be bringing that in real time into the studio. What you have down the right-hand side of your screen, this is Phonebox 4, by the way, so you can relax. I think everybody here is a Phonebox customer, so this is what you'll be getting when we roll out Phonebox 4. This is what the right-hand side of your screen will look like. It's a series of radio stations, one that lets you listen to people talking about you, one that lets people look at the smart context you're in. That might be a guest you have in for interview, it might be geographically based around a news event, it might be the most influential people on Twitter, who here are Trevor, Dan, Matt and James, unsurprisingly. And all you have to do is click down there to listen to those different channels and you're listening to your audience at the correct time, in the correct context. Now, we also make the problem 5,000 times worse by listening to everything your audience is saying to each other. So everybody who follows you, or everybody you follow, we listen to everything they're saying. We've been listening to everything you've been saying today. We've been testing it by listening to everybody who's mentioned Justin Bieber, One Direction, or the iPhone over the last few months. Some of my programmers have needed therapy after that, but there's an awful lot of stuff out there if you follow those things. We follow all of your listeners, whether they follow you or not, all of their public statuses, everything they're talking about. So we can tell you in real time what they're talking about. Before you open the microphone, you'll know what the most retweeted message is. Here today, it was about the one, somebody said earlier on, making great radio makes you better. That's the most retweeted comment by everybody in this room during the course of today. So we know what people are talking about. The second thing, and I have 14 seconds left, is make it quick to do something with that. Once you've read this great content, once you've bubbled it to the top, you have 2 seconds to do something with it. You read the 140 characters, and we let you get it to the newsroom, to the travel department, RSVP it to Mark. I have to come back to this later on. So make it trivially easy to use it immediately in the studio. We've also invented a piece of technology called Mirage, which makes the Oasis stuff visible to the outside world. So you can put this curated content inside Radio Player, thumbs up, thumbs down, with one line of code to interact in real time with the studio. Messages from any of those platforms, be it web, mobile, or Radio Player, straight back into the studio using that technology. And finally, we want to make things go viral. But we talk about viral with a small v. So, for example, we have the data to know that we read somebody's tweet on air this morning. So after we've read it out, we send them a DM or an email back if we join up the dots to their identity, and we say, thanks for your tweet this morning. In case you missed it, click here to listen again. Radio loves listen again, doesn't it? But it's all a bit podcasty, it's all a bit heavyweight. But if you tweeted a station and we sent you a DM back that says, thanks for being on the station, click here to listen again, the first thing you're going to do is send that to all your mates. So it's viral, but a very targeted form of viral with a small v. The people on the other end want to make that viral because it's content that's compelling and original and directed at them. It's a small v viral. Each of those people may get you to 100 people, maybe a couple of hundred if you're lucky. But do 250 DMs a day, do that each day of the year, you can have upwards of 3 million extra people who are engaged with your content just by repurposing what you already have. The other thing we do is this send screen. That allows you, while you're talking on air, to touch the screen 3 times. During that period, you can say, send a message to everybody who engaged with the station in the last 30 minutes, who also likes or follows One Direction, and send them a message to say One Direction's coming in the studio tomorrow. Oh, by the way, make sure we haven't messaged them in the last 3 days and they like or follow One Direction. Send that to the top most viral people like Trevor Dan, and let them do the legwork for you. They want the information because they're already engaged. They have the followers who may be P1s or maybe something less, but let them do the work for you. So finally, all sorts of analytics, all the stuff that Jen was talking about is one touch away on the screen. Press a button, all these charts pop up. But the most important thing is in the top right-hand side of the screen, we have this signal strength. What this measures is the bandwidth between your audience and you, not the strength of your FM signal or your DAB signal. It measures the strength of the connection between you and the audience in reverse. So if you only have 1 bar on here, you have lots of listeners. You're doing lots of stuff, but we measure it by day of the week and by hour of the day. If you have 1 bar, you have a lot of listeners. Well done. If you have 5 bars, you're close to the audience. You have a strong signal. The bandwidth between you and them is at its absolute maximum. You're in the top 10% of engagement based on those retweets and messages and so on. Then you're making radio that no one is listening to. Then you have what we describe as being a social studio. Bandwidth is driving everything, and we're good enough at it that it's not about monetizing something that's regulated. It's about driving that. A social studio that produces original and compelling content that no one wants to listen to. So thank you for coming today. I know some of you paid for it yourselves. I know some of you worked on your laptops while you were here. It's appreciated by me, by James and Matt, and everybody who was here. But thank you most of all for not listening.
Dan McQuillan was great, an inspirational speaker, really captured the whole session, the whole conference, and brought it together to a really good finish that captured all of the themes about communicating in 2 ways with the audience.
It has, for the large part, been all about us. To a large extent, it needs to be all about the audience. That was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, to be honest.
I've come away really excited about radio's future, and that's one of the good things about this conference.
Next.